Sarah Jaffe.
Is this thing on? Oh, look at that. I can't believe there's this many people in here who want to hear us come be nerds about the media. This is great. Thank you for all being in this room. I'm impressed that we filled this room. I am an independent journalist, as Jeff was just saying. In fact, I literally am independent in that I don't have a job. I have a fellowship and a book. It's sort of like having a job, except without the health insurance. And what I do is I cover labor and social movements. And up until about 2011, that was not a thing you could really make a full-time job of doing. I joke that the Wisconsin uprising created my career, made it possible for me to actually be a labor journalist. So thank you, those of y'all who are in the room, who were part of that, or who were tweeting about it, because I think most of us were following it on Twitter. Before that, I tried to sell labor stories to the publications that now, email me and call me and ask me to cover something, and they didn't know why anybody would want to do that. So that leads me to my first major point, which is, of course, the political revolution did not start with Bernie Sanders. It will not end with Bernie Sanders. It has been going for several years now. Bernie is an important, significant phase in this movement for a lot of reasons. But the reason we're all here is that a lot of people around this country, around several different issues, took to the streets, occupied parks, occupied state capitals, got arrested, got in trouble, which is where the title of my book comes from, and really made it visible across this country that people weren't going to take it anymore. People had enough. That we had just had this massive, massive financial crisis, right? We had a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism nearly committed suicide. Sadly, it didn't succeed, but we'll help it along next time. And so the mainstream media kind of went along like this was just, they believed the hype that this was just a little downturn. It's not that big a deal. It's fine. And people were suffering. And it would drive me crazy because I would be, everybody would be going, where are the people in the streets? Why aren't people in the streets? And I'm like, if y'all would make a little bit of an effort, you could find the people in the streets. And then a really interesting thing happened, which was that the Tea Party happened, and Fox News, and normally no major broadcast outlet or newspaper or anything really spends any time covering protests. They generally ignore them and pretend they don't exist. And the weird thing about the Tea Party was that Fox News, and because Fox News did it, then CNN did it, and MSNBC did it, really started to get behind a protest movement of people who were, they were right-wing people, but they were causing trouble. And for once in this country, a major news network was saying that protests were a good thing. It's kind of weird. But of course, everybody in this room is presumably not the Tea Party. I don't know, do we have any Reform Tea Party people in here? That'd be great. I'd be really excited about that, actually. But the starting point of this wave of movements that we talk about a lot, that I write about in this book, was in Wisconsin in 2011. It really was. It was this bill that was going to strip public sector workers of their collective bargaining rights, which is like such a wonky phrase. Like, I liked it and knew what it meant. I mean, I didn't like it, but I, am aware of all of those terms and what they mean when put in that order. And I was completely shocked that there were enough people who would not only protest this, but literally take over the state capitol for weeks on end and sleep there. And, it's amazing. I have a bunch of the videos bookmarked on my computer, so when I'm having a bad day, I watch like flash mobs singing songs from Les Miserables in the middle of the Wisconsin Capitol. It's really great. And the way we all found out about that was Twitter. Right? And that was, again, 2011, not that many people were on Twitter yet, but suddenly this whole movement was happening in front of us on social media. Mainstream media didn't cover it. They eventually covered it because everybody was talking about it. And they kind of had to because independent media was there telling the story and was working together. There were I worked at the time for Laura Flanders for Grit TV. And Laura went out there and she worked with the folks from the Uptake, and we're in the wonderful, wonderful Wisconsin community radio station, WORT, and we're filming in there. And you actually had this wonderful interplay of independent media getting the story out because it wasn't on CNN. And then, of course, we had Occupy Wall Street, which the same story. So the first day that I went down to Occupy was day 5, and I lived in New York. And the first people that I met were the media table, and they had Wi-Fi set up in Zuccotti Park, and they were telling their story. And they were, they were on Twitter, they had a Facebook page, they were out there telling the story of this movement, because once again, nobody was paying attention. That was when live streaming technology took off, and people were, live streaming from their cell phones, which is now a thing we do all the time. And so again, these movements keep happening. They are left out of the major media outlets, who eventually come around to covering them because the people who are participating in them understand that making media about their movement is part of the fight. It is part of the way that you bring more people into your struggle. It's part of the way that you make yourself a reliable source for what's going on in your life. We saw that. I'm in Chicago. I have to talk about the Chicago teacher strike. Do I have any Chicago teachers in the room? Yay! Round of applause. All right. Same thing, right? The Chicago teachers were getting their story out on social media. We're telling their own story. We're being the experts in education, not a bunch of random people that, gave a lot of money to Rahm Emanuel, so we put them on the school board. Penny Pritzker, I'm staying in the Hyatt right now, which is weird. It's not under boycott anymore, though, guys. It's cool. And then Black Lives Matter, right? First, the death of Trayvon Martin and the protests around that I was in Chicago actually when the Zimmerman acquittal came down, and within 2 hours there were protests in God, what park was it? I don't remember. And I could find it because I knew who to follow on social media, and so when I talk about sort of changing the conversation, which is a thing that we talked about a lot after Occupy sort of faded, and people would say, well, what did Occupy accomplish? What did Occupy accomplish? And I'm like, when you say it changed the conversation, it kind of feels like nothing. Like, it can really feel like this is not a significant accomplishment, that we didn't really do anything. But we're all here. We're all talking about inequality. We're talking about socialism. We're talking about $15 an hour as a minimum wage, which people, put out there as a demand that everybody thought was going to be crazy. Well, it's the law of the land in a bunch of places now. We actually have to think about changing the conversation as something that is really significant. And I'm not going to get really wonky on media theory in here because y'all aren't that interested, but bringing things in from the outside, things that were previously unspeakable and unthinkable, is a really, really important task. And it's why, it's not that the media was in the tank for Hillary Clinton so much as that these things are literally unthinkable and unspeakable. That single-payer health care, that saying in the first debate, like, no, I'm not a capitalist, those things where you could not say them. You literally could not say them. I couldn't say them. My editors wouldn't let me say them. Now I can. That's a huge change that's happened. When I was trying to sell this book 2 years ago, nobody knew what to do with this. Everybody was like, what movement? What movement? That was August 3rd. Everybody in here knows what happened on August 9th, right? And so I went back in and I was like, this isn't stopping. This didn't stop, right? Ferguson certainly hasn't stopped. And so, yeah, I think, and that leads me into part 2, which is that the thing that I have done in the political revolution moment is actually not cover the election. It's actually keep covering the movements. It's actually, because you know what? Everybody is writing think pieces about the election. There are 300 of them every single day, and they mostly all say the same thing. And that's just, it's done. It's been done. Somebody is going to say what I would have said if I was doing that. I certainly was not going to break any news about the election, but I could break some news about workers who are going on strike. And so throughout this whole process of, you know, the unending election cycle, I just didn't cover the election. And because of that, I'm still doing what I do. I'm still covering movements. I'm still covering stories. If you want me to cover yours, you should come talk to me afterwards. Because I think that that's really important. It's really important constantly to point out that the revolution didn't begin with Bernie Sanders, that the movement didn't begin with Bernie Sanders, that the change that, the fact that Bernie Sanders was able to get over 12 million votes, and I don't have an exact number because caucuses are weird, I didn't think that was possible at the beginning of this, and I've been covering this, and I just wrote an entire book arguing about how much this country has changed, and I didn't think that Bernie Sanders was going to win, you know, 40-something% of Democratic primary voters. I thought 10, maybe. Right. And like, yeah, the fact that like Martin O'Malley just like, who's Martin O'Malley again? Where'd he go? What happened to that guy? It's just not gone. Poor, I don't really feel bad for him. And so the last thing I want to say as a media person, and as talking about all of these people making themselves the experts in their own lives and telling their own stories, is one of the things that I think is really important as a journalist, and as a journalist who considers themselves a check on the corporate media, is that like in doing that we have to be accurate. I've seen a lot of people, a lot of, you know, younger Bernie supporters, a lot of people who weren't political before this, sort of sharing like very conspiracy theory-ish blogs and things. And I think it's really important to say the things that you were not supposed to say. I think it's also really important to like tell the truth and have some facts. And a lot of the time the facts are on our side. We don't have to make them up because we actually have them. And so, you know, I think that one of the things I would love to get out of this and actually talk about a little bit more, because I'm surrounded by people who also care about this issue, is to talk about how we can really think about media literacy for people. How do you explain to people what is a reliable source, how you figure out if it is a reliable source? Because as Jeff said, sometimes independent journalists break really, really important things. But it's a question of knowing how to figure out what the story is. So not to be too much of a downer, but I am going to end on that note. And
Sarah Jaffe.